In this recording, I'd like to show you how to create and then modify, customize pivot tables. Pivot tables allow you to see data, statistics, sums, averages, grouped by multiple fields. It's much harder to describe than it is to show you, and once you've seen a pivot table and its power, you'll create a lot. You'll use them. I use them a lot. And what's nice, in the next recording, I'll show you how easy it is to use the data in a pivot table to create a chart. I'll be using the Unit 3 sample that I've already modified a couple of times in my Unit 3 sample done. If you haven't been following in the previous recordings, when you open Unit 3 sample, you should go to the Faculty Data tab and change this into a data table by doing an Insert Table. That much is required, and really even that isn't required. I discovered recently that when you're creating pivot tables can be created on either a table, makes it a little easier, or even on a range. And here's my subtotal sheet from the Unit 2 recordings, and I can insert a pivot table from this. Now, be cautious though, if you create a pivot table from a subtotals range of data, the subtotals will try to be included in the pivot tables, and your pivot tables can be weird. And if I remember right, I even get a warning saying, hey, you got subtotals, might not be a good idea, and that's what this is. So I'm going to create my subtotals from the Faculty Data tab, and again, I have a total here. If you don't have one, it shouldn't make any difference. Excel will recognize that that's a total row and shouldn't be included in the pivot table. To create a pivot table, put your cursor anywhere inside of your table, and then in the Insert tab, choose Pivot Table. The Excel dialog box will ask you which range do you want, and I named my table salaries, so it recognizes that name. If you don't have a name, it'll put the values, the cell values in here, the ranges. And pivot tables generally work better in a new worksheet, though you can add them to an existing worksheet. So I'm going to do a new worksheet. And there's my new worksheet. It has a pivot table, all the tools for pivot tables ready for me to use. But before I create my pivot table, I'm going to rename my sheet. I'm going to call this salaries. I'm going to move it to the end just to demonstrate that it's the last thing that I did. And you should also rename your pivot table so that if you decide to use it later for charts, you can refer to it by name instead of by its range. So I'm going to call that salaries as well. To create a pivot tables are set up kind of like Excel spreadsheets. They have rows and columns. You have to decide which field values, notice here are the field values from my table, which field values you want for row labels, which field values you want for column labels. Most of the examples in the book make everything row labels, and that's perfectly okay, but I'm going to show you how you can use rows and columns to create what I think is a little easier to read table, but then how to manipulate it until you see the data the way you want to present it. So in this case, what I want to know is what is the average salary for each, let me see here, what was it I wanted to do, for each department by gender. I have maybe a faculty member who is suggesting that there is a gender bias in salaries, and we want to do some analysis on that. I want to look in each department. What I recommend in my notes is that when you're trying to figure out what to make rows and columns, figure out the distinct number of values. In the department, there are 4 distinct values, 4 distinct departments. There's 3. There's 3 departments, 4 ranks. 3 departments, and of course there are 2 sexes. So what I recommend in my notes is whichever has the most distinct values, make that your row. So I'm going to take my department values and add them to my rows. Try that again. There we go. And notice what Excel does is it goes into the department field and it finds each unique, distinct value in that, and it creates a row. So there's a row for accounting, finance, and management. I want sex to be the column value, so I'm going to drag that over here into the column section. Again, Excel goes into the sex column, finds each of the distinct values, of course there's only 2, and creates a column for each one of those. Looks a little clumsy right now. And now what I want to do in the values area is calculate the average salary. So I'm going to take the salary down here. Notice by default it becomes the sum. And notice what happens here. We'll change that in just a second because we want averages. But notice what happens Excel says, all right, go find all the people who work in the accounting department who are female and give me their total salary. All the people who work in accounting who are male, give me their total salary, and then repeat that process for every department. If there were 16 departments, there would be 16 rows of departments here and still 2 columns for male and female. So whichever you have the most of, I suggest making that the rows. The field that has the most distinct values, here there's 3. And then whichever you have, and then make the other one the column heading. So, and if you get it wrong, you can always just move these around. If I wanted to, I could take the sex field from here, move it over to here, take the department, and move it over to there. And now I get the same values. They're just organized in a different way. Most people find tables that are a little narrower, easier to read. So let's see if I can undo that. Yep. And that puts it back again. Now what I don't want is the sum of salary. I want the average salary because I want to either dispute or confirm this person's suspicions. To change this, you simply drop it down. And then we have field value settings that we can change. In the field value settings, the default is sum, but I really want the average. Notice when I click on average, it also changes the name of that column. Initially, it's sum. So that's one of the advantages of doing it this way, using the value field settings, and click on OK, and now I get averages in each one. But those are very hard to read because each one has a different number of decimal places. I could highlight all those values, use the Home tab to change all the decimal places, but I can also use that values field settings to change the number format. I want to change it. I don't want any dollar signs, clutters things up. I'm just going to use the comma. I mean the number format. I do want to use 1,000 separator, and I think I'm going to leave it at 2 decimal places, but really we're talking about salaries here. The 2 decimal places probably don't make much difference, but I'll leave them there just to show you what happens. And now this is a little easier to read and a little easier to decipher. Here we have 42 for females, 51 for males, 41, 43, 37, 47, overall 41, 48. Our person's suspicion may be accurate. But what we don't have here is the number of years these people have been working here, or any other considerations. Some might be part-time, some might be full-time. But at least initially it looks like there's some support for this suspicion, and we can dig into a little bit more. That's not the point. The point is we can create a pivot table with column headings and row headings that are the values inside of a table, and do calculations on each one of those values. If you don't like the way this looks, you can manipulate it a little bit. Maybe the person who's involved or the supervisor who's asking you to look into this would like to see this broken out by ranks. You don't have to have just one field in the rows and columns section. So I could bring the ranks in and tuck it in underneath the department. And now what happens is for each one of my departments, it splits them up into their appropriate ranks. And notice that the ranks, because of what I did in a previous worksheet over here in faculty data, I sorted by rank where the order is instructor, assistant, associate, full, custom sorting. It sensed that and it retained it. So if yours are alphabetizing these, it's because you don't have the custom sorting that we did. And I believe it was the first recording that I did for Unit 3. So you can go back and look at that. But here, once again, we can start looking at these. And it looks like for every rank in every department, the females are paid less than the males. So that's adding a little more support to this supposition that females are not paid as much as males. But again, that's not the point. The point is that we can do multi-levels of grouping here. And if we want to, we can hide, just like we did in subtotals. We can collapse to hide the details if I'm talking to somebody about this, and then expand them to see the details if I wish. You can move these things around, see what happens. What happens if I put rank over here? Okay, then I get instructors male, instructors female, assistants male, assistants females, and so on. Okay, and maybe this is a little, I think it's a little harder to read, so I'm going to undo that, Control Z, and put it back. This makes a little, I think this is easier for me to read. The point is you can start moving these things around to make them look just the way you want. Can actually move the gender over here and put it at the bottom. It's a little tricky because of my small screen, but I'll just park it in the middle there. And now the genders are inside here. These are the female instructors, the male instructors. But it might make more sense to move them up and rearrange the order. Now here's all the females, here's all the males. Right. A lot of different ways you can set these pivot tables up. This one doesn't have column values anymore. A lot of the examples in the book simply sticking everything into the rows and calculate based on these unique values. I'm going to move the sex back into my column headings because I thought that was probably the easiest to read. Sometimes these totals don't make a whole lot of sense. The average for accounting instructors or accounting faculty may not make a lot of sense. So we can hide some of these. The way you hide them is click inside the pivot table, go to the Design tab, and for the grand totals you can turn them off altogether. Now there's no totals if it doesn't make any sense at all. Or you can turn them on for the row all, that's what we had to start with, or the rows only. That's not the one I want, but the one at the bottom was kind of interesting. So I'm going to change it to columns only. And then down at the bottom it says, on average in our school, females are paid $41,000 and males are paid $48,000. That one has some value, the other one less so. I'm just showing you that you can turn them off if the values that are calculated for grand totals are not exactly of any value to you. Like just about everything else we've done in Excel so far, you can change the style of this. So if I wanted to, I can in pivot table design, change the style. Some of them have multicolors. So let's go to red here, and it kind of makes the thing stand out. So that's handy. Just mess with those until it reads the way you want it to. What else do we want to do here? There are different kinds of built-in layouts. Again, I'm in PivotTables Design. There's a report layout list that you can choose from. The book doesn't have you do this and doesn't talk about it. It shows everything in compact form, which is what we have right now. There's also an outline form. If you watch carefully behind the scenes, you'll see things kind of shift around a little bit. Notice that the instructor used to be underneath. Now it's over here, so it's kind of indented, so maybe you like that better. And finally, there's also a tabular form. What happened there is here's the layout of here's accounting, and then the instructor is used in the same row before it was underneath. It's just a style thing. You can choose whichever one you want. I think I will hang on to this tabular layout. Again, the book doesn't ask you to change it. As you can see, in addition to columns, rows, and values, we can also designate filters. However, a field, like departments, cannot be both a row or column and a filter. It can be one or the other. So I'm going to drag department from here to filters, and notice it removed it from the rows. So now the department is no longer here. And I can't see these broken out by department, but I can filter by them now and say I only want to see, for instance, management. Okay. That's okay, but I liked the way it was broken out before. So I'm going to move the department back into the rows where it was before. And if I want to filter, I can actually use these little arrows and say I only want to see the management people and use that filtering instead. And I think that's a little more effective in this case. But what you can do is create filters that aren't included in the table. So I could filter by year hired and only show the people who were hired in the 80s and analyze their data. I wasn't planning on this, but let's try that. I'm going to remove this filter, select everybody, and I'm going to add the year hired as a filter. There it is. And instead of all of them, I'm going to say that I can select multiple values, and I want to select just the people who were hired in the 80s. Okay, all those people are now full professors, and I don't think there's any females left. That's interesting. That can tell you something as well. That wasn't planned, so I'm going to remove that. Remove one of these, just drag it away, and now that filter is gone. I don't like this label. A couple of ways to change it. That label, you might have noticed, was designated in the field value settings, so we can go to field value settings and actually change it right here. Anytime we can call it whatever we want. Alternatively, you can simply click in the cell and change it up here. So either one of those works. So that reads a little bit better, looks a little more professional. one thing, this pivot table is not bound to the data that created it. Remember, when we built this pivot table, we started in faculty data. So I'm going to go back to faculty data, and just so I can find a person very, very quickly, I'm going to sort by last name. And here's Bordeaux, and let's say she's been given a raise of $44,000. And notice that she's an assistant professor in management. Right. If we go to salaries, the assistant professor in management for female right there is $42,000. That has not changed. She is, it turns out, is the only assistant professor in management, and it has not updated. If you change the original data and you want the pivot table to reflect that change, you have to tell the pivot table to update itself by going to the Analyze tab and refreshing it. And then it will go back to the original data. It remembers where that came from. Remember, which said salaries table. And it will get the new data, and now you can see that Bordeaux's new salary is reflected in the pivot table. So remember, when you create these pivot tables, that if the original foundation data changes, the pivot table doesn't automatically update it. So as a quick review, we went to a table, we inserted a pivot table, and then we designated department as the row values and sex as the column values, because there are more unique values in departments than in sex. Determined what we wanted to calculate, and then we experimented with a little bit, moving some things around, decided this is the best layout that we liked. Okay. Filtered, formatted. But this type of data, particularly if you have a lot of data, I don't have a whole lot of faculty in here, but if you have a lot of it, this can really display the data in a very effective way. And again, if the data changes, can be updated very, very quickly.